So let's take this example. And says, I can't afford to pay rent this month. And the landlord says, that's okay. You're a student. I will waive your rent until August. And for all our lawyers up there, it is December 1st in this example. Student says, thank you. Now I can buy my textbooks, and relies on that representation and uses their money to purchase textbooks. 3 weeks later, i.e. not August, the landlord comes back and says, never mind, actually I need your payment. So here, inherently, we know that's unfair, right? And so when you see that inherent unfairness, you want to think, let's look at the elements of promissory estoppel and see if it applies. So the 4 elements are here. The first requirement is that there's an existing legal relationship. And so in our example here, there's an existing legal relationship because they are a landlord and tenant. Second, there has to have been a clear representation that another party promised another. And so in this instance, the clear representation is them saying, you don't have to pay rent until August. Next, that representation must have been relied upon. And this should kind of be bringing back the intentional tort tests that we talked about before the midterm. Of not only need there be a representation, that representation had to have been relied on to the detriment of the plaintiff. Finally, that first triggering element that I talked about, that inequality, that bad behavior, the requirement is that it would simply be unjust or unfair to allow the promisor to go back on their word. And so those are the elements that need to be satisfied. We have our and highlighted there. All of these need to be satisfied in order to successfully rely on promissory estoppel to enforce a promise without consideration. The next concept that we're going to explore is privity of contract. And privity is a word that generally refers to how close two things are to each other. Privity of contract refers to a relationship between the parties. And remember, the parties are the people who actually are making the agreement. And we talked about a third-party beneficiary who could be another person benefiting from the agreement between the parties. Typically, the rule is that only the parties to a contract can enforce the contract. Or in other words, only the parties of the contract can sue on that contract. However, there are several exceptions to this rule, all of which are listed here. So a statute, assignment, trusts, and employment relationship are all exceptions to the rule that only parties can sue on a contract. A statute is a piece of law. And so a piece of law could say that a certain category of third parties are permitted to enforce these kinds of contracts, even if the parties aren't party to that contract. And so an example of that is life insurance. So in life insurance, I, as the insured, could purchase life insurance from an insurance company on my life for, $300,000 and say, when I die, I want $300,000 to go to my spouse under these circumstances. And there'd be certain limitations to that, not important to this example. When I pass away, my spouse can then enforce that life insurance contract to benefit from it, even though he wasn't party to the contract. And so there is an example of where a statute would permit an exception to that general rule. Another instance another instance where there is an exception is if there has been assignment of contractual rights to a third party. And so in certain situations, like if I'm a company and I am really not able to collect payment from one of my clients, I can contract with a debt collector, so assign my rights to collect under my original contract to the debt collector to pursue the payment from the client on my behalf at a certain commission or rate or however it works. And so that instance is the debt collector enforcing an agreement that it wasn't party to, because it wasn't party to the client service provider relationship, but it's been assigned the ability to enforce the service provider's rights. That's an exception to the general rule that only parties to the contract can sue on the contract. A trust is a document I'll talk a little bit more about next lecture. But generally speaking, a trust is a document created in favor of a third-party beneficiary. So if a parent wants to set aside money for their child's education, they could put that money in trust. And trust documents are really cool tools that you could really get creative with and define different terms around. But the purpose of the example here is that if, for example, the trust funds are only designated to be used for education, and the parents haven't defined what they mean by education in the trust document, the third-party beneficiary, the child, would have the right to sue on that contract and argue that, their trip to Paris constitutes a cultural education or something like that. The third-party beneficiary and trusts have the ability to dispute and sue on and enforce contracts, get their rights as outlined in those documents, even though they weren't original parties to that document. And finally, employees who are employed by an organization might be able to enforce a contract between their employer and a client, even though they weren't party to that contract. So often in the employment context, an employer will enter into an agreement where they have clauses that benefit their employees. And so an example of this could be a limitation of liability clause, which says, if we break your stuff, we're not liable to pay for it unless it's over $1,000 or, something like that. And even though the employee themselves was not party to that agreement between the organization and the whoever's purchasing their services, the employee would be able to benefit from that contract as a third-party beneficiary because the terms of that contract speak to and imply that the employees of the organization will actually be the ones carrying out the work. And so to maybe drive home this example, if we were talking about an employee who was a moving company and broke a lamp at the client's house while they were moving, and they have that limitation liability clause that says we're not liable unless the damage is over $1,000, the employee would be able to enforce that agreement and benefit from that limited liability clause. They could be sued personally because they benefited from that original contract. So that is the employment exception. So that's consideration. Next class, we are going to talk more about the terms of contracts and contractual interpretation. And again, I'll delve a little bit more into some of these trust and potentially employment contracts that I think are really relevant to many of your industries.